Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the latest instalment of Humanities versus Pandemics, our ongoing interdisciplinary research seminar where we take a variety of approaches to discuss the COVID-19 pandemic, how it has impacted research of various kinds, and how our research in turn can help us understand and perhaps combat the pandemic. And today we have Dr. Elliot Bowen, who is going to tell us about COVID-19, the media, and historical memory. So I'm going to turn over now to Professor Bowen. Go ahead.
Thank you, Claire, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who has logged in for this talk. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share with you some of my research on COVID-19, the media, and history. The genesis for my remarks today comes from a short paper that I published back in May. This was during the 4th month of the current COVID-19 pandemic. And I was approached by a couple of my grad school friends who run this kind of alt academia blog that is called Clio and the Contemporary. You can see the blurb there on the screen. And they were wondering if I would be interested in posting a short paper detailing kind of historical perspectives on the current pandemic and kind of what we can learn perhaps from comparing it to earlier pandemics in human history. And I have to say, when they asked me to write something, I was initially kind of reluctant because as a historian, talking about contemporary events is not something that I am that familiar with. And so for a while, I had this kind of ongoing battle in my head to decide, can I do this? What would I do it about if I did do it? Is it really wise for a historian to talk about present day events? But as I, looked and see what other people were publishing about this, I realized that, there are actually lots of historians talking about COVID-19 and comparing it to earlier disease outbreaks. So why shouldn't I try to do it myself? So I spent a little bit of time researching and eventually published this short piece, which if you want, you can read in its entirety on the website Clio and the Contemporary. It's a really great blog. They have lots of different posts on various topics. I would encourage anyone to take a look at it. So when I was struggling to come up with something to write about, my first kind of inspiration was to look at the media, because at the time we were all being bombarded on a daily basis with stories in newspapers, on the radio, TV news broadcasts, of course, about COVID-19. It is, especially in the early part of the pandemic when there was so much uncertainty around what this new virus was and what the consequences of contracting the virus would be, the media kind of filled a really important void in our knowledge of this very new, mysterious disease. And so obviously it's a little bit overwhelming to be bombarded with news media stories every hour of the day. But I also thought these could potentially be useful sources for doing an examination of the media's role in constructing ideas about COVID-19 and about the pandemic as it spread all across the world. So I decided to run with this initial idea of focusing on the media and the way it has represented this disease. And doing that brought me in touch with a lot of scholarship on the disease. Because there is a fair amount of academic writing on the media, and in particular, the way that media accounts give us a sense of the kinds of societal preoccupations or cultural attitudes that influence the way that diseases are depicted and the way that information about diseases is disseminated by journalists. I was particularly interested in the historical dimension of this question. I wanted to know how either COVID-19 would shape the way that historians see earlier outbreaks of epidemic disease, or alternatively, how knowledge of past pandemics could influence our understanding of COVID-19 in terms of our understandings of it, the way we respond to it, and those kinds of things. So I started with the general scholarship on disease discourses within the media. And of course, one of the things that makes the media play such an important role in disease outbreaks is that they kind of serve as a bridge between the scientific community and the lay community. They translate and transmit scientific information to the public about the causes and about the potential consequences of epidemics whenever we are struck with them. And in this context, the health messaging that the media engages in can often provide people with very important life-saving information, especially about the kinds of behavioral changes that are often needed for survival in an epidemic, especially in an epidemic like COVID-19, for which there are no cures or no vaccines at present. So the media does really play a life-saving role here. And this is, in fact, something that global health bodies like the WHO have recognized. In the WHO's own studies, they often reach conclusions that ineffective media communication can delay disease control efforts and also kind of prolong the physical and social and economic toll that pandemics cause. So the media is really important. It plays an important role in disease outbreak situations, and I wanted to kind of figure out how that's relevant to the current pandemic. Also, I should say, the media doesn't just passively convey information from public health professionals to the masses. They're actually an active participant in the way that societies decide to respond to epidemics. Journalists, they don't just passively transmit and translate information. They also produce judgments. They issue critiques. They endorse certain ideas and they reject others. That is to say that the media comes to epidemics with its own assumptions, its own biases, and often its own agendas, which are not necessarily the same as those of public health professionals or global health bodies. And this is particularly true in the context of epidemics where there's a lot of uncertainty, especially in the early phase of epidemics. There's an information void, and the media often fills that with its own assumptions and ideas about these novel viruses that we're confronted with. And this is something that gives the media a lot of power and a lot of influence. So the question that I came to after considering this a little bit was, how are health threats treated in the media? What influences the way that these threats are treated? What are some of the assumptions that are embedded in media reportage of public health threats? And also, what kind of impacts might these reports have on individual perceptions of disease and of the way that we as people change or don't change our behaviors after reading media accounts of disease? So, given the fact that media outlets are active participants in discussions about disease, given the fact that they actively transform our understandings of epidemics, we need to ask about the societal preoccupations that inform the media's coverage of disease events. The meanings that the media assigns to disease impact our own illness experiences, and these often reflect wider cultural and political realities. And there's a good deal of scholarship that investigates these things. In reviewing the literature on this subject, we can come to see that there are a lot of prominent themes in the way that the media tends to handle epidemics when they occur. Some of the more common themes that scholars have noted in writing about this topic include a tendency within the media to prioritize the voices of elites, to privilege their views over the views of less powerful groups. For example, in media coverage of epidemics, there's often a tendency to elevate men's voices over women's voices. Another common theme in media reporting about epidemics is a tendency to individualize illness. That is to say, to consider it in terms of personal stories and the individual impacts that this disease has on people, instead of placing it in a broader socioeconomic and or political context. Third, a common theme in the literature, we've seen that in a lot of media accounts of disease, there is a tendency to focus on cures, vaccines, treatments, generally speaking, the medical management of illness. There's a lot of reporting that focuses almost explicitly on the biomedical search or quest for cures and vaccines, and this leads to a downplaying of other experiences of epidemics that don't have to do with, for example, scientists' race to discover a vaccine. There is also, along with this, a tendency to stigmatize illness. Media reports of disease often stigmatize disease by connecting it to long-standing fears or anxieties, particularly those surrounding race, class, ethnicity, sex, gender, and sexuality. Next, there is also a common tendency to downplay or to refute claims that contest medical power or that foreground medicine's weakness in the face of new disease challenges. So we tend to hear a lot about promising developments in medical science. We get lots of stories about how individual pharmaceutical companies or individual doctors are getting closer and closer to discovering a cure for a disease or a vaccine for a disease. But we don't hear so much about failures, about developments that didn't lead to anything successful. That's a common tendency in media coverage of epidemics in particular. There's also a kind of general tendency in representations of disease in the media to talk about epidemics in a very conservative way. And I don't mean conservative in a political sense. What I mean is that often when the media reports on diseases, they do so in a way that is very traditional, that tells and retells a society's kind of founding or origin myths about itself. So that is, generally speaking, what scholars find in their research on disease discourses in the media. One of the interesting things is that there actually hasn't been a whole lot of scholarship on these questions that looks at them in a historical sense. So a lot of the literature that I just kind of briefly reviewed focuses on the contemporary period and the way that the media treats disease in our own day and age. We have relatively little scholarship when it comes to the ways that the media uses the past, or the way that the media invokes the past, so as to create meaning around a current disease threat. There are a couple of good examples of this that I was able to draw on for my own research, but it is, on the whole, a pretty underdeveloped field. And this is part of the reason that I'm kind of interested in contributing to historical knowledge about the way that the media uses the past to help us understand current epidemics. There are a couple of good studies, just two of which I have included in the slide you're looking at right now. The first one you see is a book that actually just came out. It was released at the end of September. I was really hoping to use it for my research, but I couldn't because it hadn't been published yet. But that is Catherine Foss's book, Constructing the Outbreak, which is about epidemics and media and collective memory. Catherine Foss is a professor of journalism and media studies at Middle Tennessee State University. Another good source for me in this, in terms of historical scholarship, was an edited volume that came out in 2004 on SARS. It is a global disease threat from 2003 that you may recall there was a lot of media coverage of. This volume that I drew on talked about the Canadian media in particular, and the way that the Canadian media used history as a lens through which to view the SARS pandemic. One of the best contributions in that volume was an essay by Georgina Feldberg, who unfortunately died in 2010, but before that wrote a really great piece talking about the way that the Canadian news media uses history to talk about tuberculosis in Canada in the present. So those were kind of my historical sources for getting my own research going. And in particular here, I wanted to highlight the work of Georgina Feldberg, because for me personally, as someone who is very new and coming to this subject, it was really instructive. And a lot of the analysis that she did kind of paved the road for the questions that I was trying to grapple with in my own research. As I said, her essay was about tuberculosis and the way that kind of past outbreaks of tuberculosis in Canada filtered into the media's coverage of SARS during the 2003 outbreak in Canada. And interestingly, one of the things that she found after her analysis, which was basically a review of hundreds of news articles published in Canadian newspapers, was that there were some common themes. And a lot of these common themes align with the general findings that I reported to you just a few minutes ago. But the key conclusion that Feldberg came to her in her research is that the media has a very narrow perspective on diseases. There was a tendency to medicalize, a tendency to individualize, and to neglect the broader socioeconomic backdrop and the broader political context under which these diseases unfold. And so, like many people, Feldberg is one of those scholars who kind of took the media to task and said, you know, you guys can do a lot better on this if you had a more historically informed perspective, if you paid attention to things like the socioeconomic determinants of illness, instead of just focusing on the attempt to come up with cures and vaccines for disease, you'd actually be giving us a much more complete picture of what this disease is all about. And so I found that really useful, and that really shaped the questions that I had myself going into an investigation of the way that the media used history to explain COVID-19 to very worried readers in the early months of the pandemic. So getting into my own research a little bit here, the questions that I was interested in pursuing come out of the existing scholarship around this topic. I was similarly interested to know how news outlets are using earlier epidemics to make sense out of the current coronavirus outbreak. I also wanted to know if the media is looking to the past for lessons, because this is a common thing that journalists do in their coverage. It is a very kind of conventional way of looking at history as a place where we can go for instructional guidance about what not to do and what to do with regard to whatever present day problems we're confronting. So that was another thing that I was interested in determining. And in particular, this question that Feldberg raised in her own analysis of SARS, I wanted to know, does the media similarly have a very narrow way of looking at COVID-19 through the lens of history? Are they approaching this in a very kind of reductionist way? And what might that tell us about the way that the media investigates and writes about epidemics in particular? So those are the questions that kind of served as a springboard for my own research, and that's what animated my search through all of the primary source accounts that I found in the media that used history to talk about COVID-19. And so in my study, obviously I could have looked at a lot of different media outlets, because even the quickest search of the internet shows that, you know, news outlets all across the world are comparing COVID-19 to earlier pandemics and using those earlier pandemics to try to give the public a sense of what might happen or what we should do to try to alleviate the problems that this pandemic is causing. I could have really gone anywhere. There is an abundance of sources, and there's a lot of research on this topic that could have been done. So as to make things manageable, I decided for the most part to confine myself to the United States, and I focused on three particular newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. I did include a smattering of reports from other news outlets, for example, the BBC, because they've had a lot of coverage, historically minded coverage of COVID-19. But in general, the sources that I were looking at were those three American newspapers. And in researching them, what I found, interestingly, was that there are really two different historical narratives that the media is telling us with regard to COVID-19. This current pandemic has kind of been placed into two separate chronologies. And they are very different. In many ways, they are directly opposed to each other. The first one is very similar to the kinds of media accounts that previous scholars like Georgina Feldberg had come across through their analysis of other epidemics. And that is a chronology that presents COVID-19 as something that is very different from earlier outbreaks, that draws a pretty firm historical divide between the present pandemic and earlier pandemics. And that does that in a way that really celebrates this idea of historical progress in medicine. And I'll show you some specific examples in a few minutes of what this particular account looks like. But basically, the goal of those accounts was to use history to provide a sense of security to readers, to basically inform the public that the current epidemic, while deadly and serious, is not as bad as things that have come before. And also, we are in a better position due to the advancement of medical science when it comes to coming up with cures and vaccines than were our predecessors in the past, who were less informed, less skilled, and less able to deal with their own epidemic situations. So that is an account and a style of reporting that is really consistent with the other scholarship on this topic, whether historically focused or not. But I also found, interestingly, that there is a kind of counter narrative emerging from some news media outlets that does the exact opposite of that. That is, instead of celebrating this idea of medical progress by severing the historical connections between COVID-19 and earlier disease outbreaks, it actually does the reverse of that. It says that this is kind of the continuation. COVID-19 is a continuation of a story that really dates back several centuries into the past. This kind of counter-narrative tries to link COVID-19 to earlier disease outbreaks by showing that there are a lot of continuities and similarities between what we're experiencing now and what our ancestors in the past experienced in terms of pandemics. So these accounts actually challenge the idea that there has been medical progress over time. And they also, instead of trying to reassure nervous readers, they actually trouble them. A lot of the reports in this vein are discomforting because they unsettle our conventional notions about medicine and its ability to fight back against deadly diseases like COVID-19. So it's interesting that I found that, in this style of writing is actually something new. It is not something that has been reported on by other scholars who have looked at this subject. So I thought that was particularly fascinating as a finding. And if you have questions about kind of either of these two styles of media history, please feel free to ask. I did want to share some examples just to give you a better sense of what each of those two stories looked like. And I'm going to start with the first one, which is the more traditional one. I have tentatively titled this narrative, "We Have Never Been More Prepared Than Now." And these are journalists who really thought that there was a difference between COVID-19 and earlier outbreaks. And just to show you some examples of this. So perhaps not surprisingly, the disease from the past that gets talked about the most in media historical discussions is the influenza outbreak of 1918, 1919. There is a lot of comparison of the 1918 flu and COVID-19, not just because they are both respiratory ailments that share some common symptoms, but also because this is the most recent public health threat in kind of living memory that challenged the entire world and had an enormously high mortality rate. So one of the examples I have here, this comes from the New York Times. It is an op-ed that was published on March 9th, 2020 by the science reporter Gina Collada. Just want to share some excerpts from this particular piece to give you a sense of how it illustrates this theme of a break between the present and the past. So one of the ways that Collada does this in her reporting is to draw a firm contrast between 1918 and the present. Among other things you can see here in the article, she says, the medical reality between then and now is really quite different. And why is it different? She goes on to explain that in 1918, the world was a very different place. For example, there were no electron microscopes. We had not yet discovered that certain diseases are caused by viruses. We didn't know what viruses were. We had no idea that they existed. The field of virology itself did not exist until after World War I. So this is one of the ways that Collada draws a contrast between then and now. And of course, she says, today, by contrast, right, researchers know how to isolate viruses. They have technologies like electron microscopes. They can do genetic sequencing of the DNA or the RNA of different viruses. We can test antiviral drugs on them to see how effective they are, and we can develop vaccines to counter them. So this is kind of part of an attempt to reassure worried publics that it's probably not going to be as bad as the 1918 flu, because all of the ways that medical knowledge and technology has advanced since 1918. Another example of this more celebratory or triumphal style of writing history comes from a piece I found in the BBC. This was published on the 3rd of March by a reporter named Stephen Dowling. And again, he's writing specifically about the 1918 flu and the things that people could learn from it in terms of combating coronavirus. You can see some of the same techniques of writing in the way that Dowling discusses COVID-19 in comparison to the 1918 flu, as with Gina Collada's reporting. He says, after World War I, much of the world had just come out of a global war, and the idea of public health itself was in its infancy. There really wasn't a good public health infrastructure for reporting on the flu or other diseases. We didn't have medical technologies to deal with infectious maladies of various kinds. He says, actually, the flu from 1918 is what led to the creation of public health systems. It led to more and better funding for scientific research designed to come up with vaccines and cures for respiratory ailments like the flu, right? He's saying all of this is a consequence of what happened in 1918 and 1919, and it should make us feel better about our prospects for successfully coping with COVID-19. To give a third example of this first style of media history, this is another op-ed from the New York Times. This one was published on March 16th, 2020 by the medical doctor Perry Klaas. And instead of comparing it to the 1918-1919 flu, what Klaas does in this piece is talk about the development of the polio vaccine in the 1950s, specifically the Salk vaccine, which proved very successful in reducing rates of polio all around the world. So the piece is titled Corona Vaccine Dreams. And really, we can see Klaas here using the past as a way to try to remind readers what the world was like before vaccines. He says in the article, imagine for a minute what it was like when there was a virus out there like smallpox, a much deadlier disease than COVID-19. Or more recently, when the virus out there was polio, which caused paralysis and death in children. Right? He's saying things were so much worse in the past. And the lesson that we should take from this new mysterious disease, COVID-19, is that they could be a lot worse if we didn't have vaccines, if we didn't know how to come up with vaccines for new disease threats when we encounter them. And he actually closes the piece by saying that what we should be reminded of is the fact that we're in a much better position now compared to our ancestor. Can't imagine what it would be to live in a world without vaccines. He says, these are one of our great human victories. They should inspire us. They should put us in awe of medical science and of the intelligence and ingenuity of those scientists who spend their time, in some cases risk their lives, to come up with cures and vaccines for diseases, right? So once again, we can see this tendency to use the past to provide comfort, reassurance, to increase or to attempt to increase people's faith in medical science, and to focus on the medical management of illness to the detriment of other kinds of stories that don't have to do with the development of drugs or vaccines. So as I said before, there is a countervailing narrative to this one. Some commentators and journalists use the past not to create distance between COVID-19 and earlier epidemics, but instead to construct linkages by showing how much hasn't changed between the past and the present in terms of the disease threats that we face as a species. And I found this style of writing to be particularly interesting because it is not something that has drawn a lot of attention from scholars previously. But just to give some examples of this, I've titled this the second narrative, the latest chapter in a story centuries in the making, to give you a sense of how these reporters are really trying to show that COVID-19 is not really that different than things that we've faced before, and also some of the other things that tend to come up with epidemics, for example, racial discrimination, bigotry of various sorts, right? That's also not new. It's not something that we have vanquished in any sense. So this first example is a report from CNN, March 17th, 2020 is the date, and it's called What Historians Hear When Trump Uses the Words Chinese and Foreign. Just to share some excerpts from this article right here. Interesting to note that in contrast to the accounts that we just looked at, this person is saying, when we compare coronavirus to earlier disease outbreaks, we see that there is a familiar ring. So just in that choice of words, we can see that this person is saying, no, actually, there's a lot of similarities between what we experienced before and what we are experiencing now. And in particular, what makes it familiar is that just as in the past, the current coronavirus outbreak has given rise or amplified racism and xenophobia all across the world. This historian actually says it's the latest chapter in a story that dates back centuries. So one of the interesting things in these accounts is that, as you can see from that first example, here we have journalists not focusing on drugs or vaccines or cures for the virus or even behavioral changes that will help limit its spread, right? They're talking about the socioeconomic side of the pandemic. Another example of this comes from Max Brooks, author of World War Z. who published an op-ed in the New York Times on March 11th, 2020. Again, drawing attention to the way that this disease, like earlier outbreaks, and here the example that Brooks gives is AIDS, that there is a tendency to stigmatize disease and to focus on specific population groups and to target them and to blame them and to stigmatize them. Brooks, very much like the CNN report that you just saw, is saying that this is a common phenomenon whenever we have epidemic outbreaks. And we haven't fixed that problem. We haven't come up with a cure to racism yet. And that is why COVID-19 has these similarities with earlier disease outbreaks. One of the interesting things about media coverage of COVID-19 is that it has featured a lot of commentaries from scholars themselves. I'm not quite sure if this has also been the case in earlier outbreaks. I don't know if academics in universities around the world had much to say in journalistic outlets about SARS or about earlier outbreaks of the flu, like the 2009 H1N1 virus. But one of the very interesting things about COVID-19 is that you do have a lot of academics kind of coming out of the tower of academia and writing very publicly facing accounts of the disease that is informed often by their own research. And just one example of this is a piece that was published as an op-ed in the New York Times by Kirsten Oster, who is a digital media's scholar at Rice University in Texas in the US. And her article similarly draws connections between the way that COVID-19 has been accompanied by a lot of racist dog whistling, racist dogmas, perpetration of racial stereotypes in the media, and also from political figures as well. And one of the things that she wants to show us in this article is that that's not new. That's been happening for a very long time. In her piece, she particularly talks about the World Health Organization and the way that WHO films from the mid-20th century often featured very racist, othering depictions of non-Western countries and presented countries in Africa and Asia, particularly as sources of contagion that threatened the stability and well-being of white peoples in Europe and North America. And in her piece, again, she is saying, this has come up again with COVID-19. It's not new. It is not something that we have come up with a cure to. And it challenges this idea that we have made progress over time. So that, I think, is all I wanted to share with you for right now. On the screen, just this last slide, I included the basic argument that I was trying to make in my paper. You can read that on your own if you like. And at this point, if anyone has questions or comments about anything that I've said, just please feel free to chime in, however is most convenient for you.
Are you moderating your own questions, or will Claire do that?
I think you can probably just ask me directly if you want to.
Okay, sure. I was waiting for, but maybe that's for your next stage of research. You were saying that in the past that the primary attention had been paid to medical discoveries or whatever. And I was going to say that it seems to me in this pandemic, in our current pandemic, I don't know so much. I haven't really been following the written press, but I've been seeing a lot on CNN, which is of course American based. And I think there's a huge emphasis on the social disparities. And I know you briefly mentioned that as an area that was not very covered, but it seems to me that the media, at least as I perceive it from CNN, because of the disparity and the diversity in the American situation, which has also been very highly politicized, that there's a lot of attention to the social disparities. And I was wondering if you are thinking of focusing on that or what, because it's interesting to me that in other countries, mostly they just talk about the generational gap, that attacks the older people that suffer more and end up, dying. And do the young children or not get it? Do they transmit it? Those kinds of, the age stuff, the generational stuff is getting attention.
Yeah.
But I've been following the British, the French, the German, and the American, and it only seems like it's the Americans that are following the you should say racial, ethnic diversity and the social class diversity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of the difference in the global coverage between the U.S. and other countries, so I'd really be interested in hearing more about that. I think you're right that in the U.S. there has been very acute attention paid to differentials in morbidity and mortality along racial and ethnic lines. Interestingly, when I first started this research, which was back in March, it was only just beginning to be covered by news outlets like CNN. The first couple months of the pandemic, within the US at least, there wasn't a whole lot of attention being paid to any kind of racial or ethnic component to the way that the virus is killing people in the US. But since then, there certainly has been a lot more coverage of that. And I think because of that, this whole idea that age is the central variable has really been downplayed in the US. And I think that's probably a good thing. I mean, one of the things we've learned is that it really has to do with comorbidities and pre-existing conditions more than anything else. And that age is not really the sole determinant of those things. It's often kind of treated as a proxy for other kinds of factors. But the US media, I would say on the whole, has done a decent job of pointing out some of the ways that structural inequalities, whether it be with regard to access to hospitals, with regard to income and financial health, all of that has played a role in determining these differentials that we see along racial and ethnic lines. And I think kind of part of what I wanted to do in this piece was kind of applaud those commentators, whether they be journalists or academics, who were using history to amplify that emerging theme in the media coverage. But I would be really interested to see how that has changed, because unfortunately, like due to other things happening in the world, I haven't really extended this research past the middle part of 2020. So if I dove back into the media and tried to see what's changed since, let's say, May or June, I might get an even better sense of, is that trajectory continuing or has it been altered in some way? But yeah, that's a really, really great point. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I remember I don't remember when it was, I'd have to go back and look, but I remember one day watching CNN, and it was like the first time I'd seen some kind of graphic of, Hispanic and Black and people in particular, employment categories. It was like, oh, right. As you said, it hadn't been discussed. And then there was one day when they started showing graphics, and now it's there almost every day.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too that, it's not the first pandemic where people have realized that things like your income and the color of your skin impact your likelihood of getting infected and your likelihood of dying if you are infected. Even in the aftermath of the 1918-1919 pandemic, there were lots of people talking about how inequalities in the housing sector, for example, were one of the key determinants of people's well-being during that pandemic. But interestingly, in the 1920s, all of that was forgotten. So in the immediate context of the war, you have, for example, the US military commissioned lots of studies that revealed that Black soldiers, for example, Black soldiers had a much higher likelihood of contracting the flu and then dying from pneumonia than did white soldiers. And at the time, there was a very clear sense that that was due to segregation, due to the fact that Black military units had substandard housing, that they were not paid an equal income for their service, that they were disregarded by medical professionals, and that their complaints were not taken seriously. That was known at the time. And in the immediate aftermath of the war, that was something that the US military itself emphasized in its own reports to Congress and other political bodies. But in the 1920s, all of those structural and socioeconomic and racial determinants of health were forgotten. And what unfortunately emerged was this new narrative, which said, oh yeah, okay, so Black soldiers died at higher rates from the flu, but that's because their biology is different. That's because they are physiologically inferior to white people. And so this earlier understanding of the disease, which I would say is more accurate, unfortunately succumbed to a racial narrative that overtook public health reporting about the pandemic in the 1920s. Hopefully that does not happen today with COVID-19. Hopefully we can keep up all of this momentum that is shedding light on the structural facets of the pandemic, and hopefully we don't forget that reality, as was what happened in 1919.
I can see Claudia had her hand raised, or Claudia, did you still have a question?
Oh, okay, cool. Yep, okay, cool. And yeah, it's interesting in the US that it did take them a little while to move into the concept of disparity between those who have health coverage and those who do not. Those who have access to good food and those who are malnourished, housing, such things. I guess over the last couple, let's say 2 weeks, I also kind of watch a lot of CNN and American News Network, and despair is the word that I came up with in relation to the Rose Garden. And as soon as I saw the Rose Garden with the priests and the politicians and all the people dancing together out there, I thought, it's like the medieval dance of death, where everybody's like, oh, we're all gonna die, so let's all forget it, you know? Yeah. And unfortunately, it seems to be kind of where they're going over the last few weeks, maybe.
It does seem to be an instance of history repeating itself.
even from 500 years ago.
of failing to heed the lessons of the past. Yeah. I've heard just from listening to news reports too, that within the White House, you mentioned the Rose Garden ceremonies and events, that interestingly, there does seem to be a kind of fatalistic understanding of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is basically to say, if I get it, I get it. There's not much I can do about it. So why change anything in terms of my personal behaviors?
There you go.
I think, it's interesting because historians are often loath to use the past to generate lessons for the present, because one of the things that you realize when you really get into primary source material is that kind of every age is different, and it's hard to draw kind of strict parallels between one age and the next. So there are some historians who have published pieces that talk about the anti-lessons of COVID-19, right? And what we can't learn from the past that will help us with regard to the present pandemic. So I do want to say that, we shouldn't be overly quick to say, oh, it's just like what happened before, because things are constantly changing, and each pandemic happens in a slightly different social context. So the way that it unfolds is never going to be exactly the same. But nevertheless, I think, as some historians have pointed out, particularly with this second news media narrative that I talked about, there are some long unlearned lessons that stretch back centuries into past epidemics, and that we are unfortunately continuing today. So thank you for that, Claudia.
Thank you.
I can see Caress has her hand raised. Caress, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. This was really super interesting. I really like what you've done here, and I think it fits a really interesting niche, because there's so much. I mean, there's media is so ingrained in all of the things that we're doing, but I think that you're really analyzing how different narratives emerge, and maybe how they might matter. So I was kind of I have a couple of questions, and one is, like, do you see that these different narratives have different views, or maybe if they fall in this, if there's other kind of parallel fault lines that are also kind of embraced by these narratives, whether that is like science, anti-science, or some sort of partisan divide, or something like that. But I also just, I feel like that's a really kind of a kind of binary way of looking at things. And so I'm not sure if I really want to ask the question in that same way, but what I'm really more interested in, I'm interested if there's something that resonates with that question, but I'm more interested in just kind of the framing of the scientificness of each of the narratives. Like, how much do they draw on kind of like epistemological frames of scientific thinking in each of these, or does that, and maybe that doesn't emerge, but I think that it would be really interesting to know.
Yeah, so on your first question, one of the things that I was curious about when I started this research was to know if the division between these competing accounts is related to things like political ideologies, or are there divisions based on the paper itself? Like, is the New York Times more willing to produce things that can be seen as anti-science than other papers, for example? And one of the things I was particularly interested in was to see, is there a difference in terms of the background of the writer themselves? As I mentioned a little bit ago, a lot of the coverage has actually been created by academics who have been very willing to add their voices to ongoing media discussions. So I kind of thought maybe it's the scholars who would be more kind of aware of the broader context in which these events unfold. But interestingly, I didn't find that there was a very, I didn't find that you could map this division in chronologies onto like the backgrounds of the writers. The first narrative that I talked about, the quote that I got from that, which is the, we've never been more prepared than now, that actually comes from a professional historian who has written a lot about the 1918 flu in particular. And he was on the side of saying, no, this is very different because we have come a long way since 1918, 1919. And on the other side, there were a fair amount of academics who were saying, this isn't different because we still have some of the problems outside of medicine that I discussed. But often those people weren't academics. Often I think those people were members of historically disadvantaged groups who could use new kinds of media platforms to broadcast a very different message about the pandemic. And sometimes doing that in non-traditional media outlets, but often finding their way onto traditional platforms like the Washington Post, for example. So there didn't seem to be a division in terms of like popular media versus more scholarly or academic media. Another thing that I'd be interested in going forward, I didn't really talk about social media at all. in this research, because that just seemed like that would be making it impossible to ever do anything. But I mean, there's a lot of scholarship that is like, what's the difference between traditional print media and social media? Is that kind of a false binary as well? And I expect that I probably would find that that is the case, that there isn't, you can't really divide things in terms of people on social media tend to think this way and people in the New York Times think another way. But that would be kind of one interesting way of extending the study. In terms of your second question about epistemologies and science, I don't know if I can say too much about that. I don't know if that was really an important way for these writers to kind of foreground or contextualize whatever it is that they were talking about. Obviously, some accounts were designed to increase the public's faith in science, and so those tended to try to use what you might call more traditional, like scientific reasoning principles. But I mean, I didn't really get, there wasn't a general attempt to write in a kind of scientific way or to approach things from the standpoint of like the natural sciences. I think if I were to look at other sources, you know, for example, the tons of research that's been published in academic journals, like that, there would be a difference. But in terms of the way things are being written for the media, I think there was a lot of consistency in that sense. I don't know if that answers your second question satisfactorily, because I probably need to think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I'm happy to prolong the discussion later and more after you think about it. But yeah, I think it is interesting. If that's actually not showing up, I think that's also pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, thanks.
So do we have further questions from anyone?
Hello, everyone. Dr. Bowen, thank you very much for the great presentation. I am a fourth-year medical student at Newsom from medical school, and I have a question. So when I was reading about the people's behavior during the COVID-19 and comparing it to the people's behavior during the Spanish flu, I have encountered many similarities in behavior of the population. What do you think about this topic? Have you encountered some differences, similarities, or any analysis on this topic? Thank you very much.
In terms of people's behavior?
Yes. And how it has changed, and what are the differences, what are the similarities in comparison with the past?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. Thank you for asking it. So it's a difficult thing to do because, especially for the past, we don't have a whole lot of data about how people were acting on a day-to-day basis. We have a lot of sources that are prescriptive in the sense that they talk about like how people should behave. We have lots of literature that we can draw on that kind of offers guidance to populations and to individuals. We're less clear on the extent to which individuals adhered to those guidelines or they obeyed regulations. So that is something that's a little bit harder to talk about. Of course, for any pandemic, you can find accounts of how people are responding, but those tend to be rather isolated and they offer kind of general observations or just kind of someone's personal account of what they did as an epidemic rolled through their city or neighborhood or their part of the world. But you know, one of the ways that we can do this, especially with 1918, 1919, because this pandemic is recent enough that we actually have a decent amount of historical data on it. So, you know, for example, we can compare the experiences of different cities. In the United States, for example, there's some pretty good scholarship on the way that Philadelphia handled the flu outbreak compared to St. Louis. And historians who have studied this have determined that cities that obeyed medical advice and that practiced non-pharmaceutical interventions, doing things like closing schools and movie theaters, banning large gatherings, those kinds of non-medical responses often led to lower infection rates and lower death rates from the disease. So we do have a sense that in those particular areas, we can know, were people adhering to existing public health suggestions from that time period, or were they disobeying them? Of course, one of the very interesting things about 1918, 1919 is that it was happening during World War I. And it was a time in many countries where there were very public social gatherings designed to do things like increase support for the war effort and bring in money in terms of funding so that governments could prosecute the war. And if you look, for example, in the US, in Philadelphia, which is a city that tried to conduct business as usual during that flu, there's photographic evidence of people out on the streets en masse, in parades, in official rallies, right, trying to increase support for the war and show Americans support for the government. And we know that those public gatherings resulted in lots and lots of infections, because we can do things like look at hospital records. And hospital admission records give us details of who on a day-to-day basis was entering the hospital, what they might have been diagnosed with. And we can see that there is a direct connection between refusing public health guidance and higher rates of disease and death from the flu. So for some of these epidemics, we can kind of contrast individual and communal behavior now versus then. But generally, it's a pretty difficult thing to do.
I see. Thank you very much.
Hello?
Do you have other questions?
Yep. Yes, Claudia.
Hi.
Hi. In the media or in the coverage of 1918, was there any kind of relationship discussed with the Spanish flu and sleeping sickness? The outbreak of sleeping sickness?
Not that I know of. Sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, yeah, okay, because I've recently read a book that, said that there might have been a connection, but I don't know if there was at that point in history.
Interesting. I should say that the title Spanish flu is a bit of a misnomer.
I hate it, yeah. That's why I stopped.
Just to anyone who's wondering, I don't use that designation because, well, for one, the flu did not originate in Spain.
Right.
The only reason that people called it the Spanish flu is, as you may know, is that Spain, being a neutral country in World War I, was one of the only ones that was actually reporting outbreaks of the disease. And reading those reports, a lot of combatant nations attributed the source of the pandemic to Spain. As best we can tell, it probably either came from the US, Western France, or China, but it's probably never something that we'll be able to tell with certainty, just because the flu travels so easily and spreads so rapidly.
Let's call it the Kansas flu from now on. Okay.
We could, yeah. I mean, generally, I think the WHO is right that we shouldn't use geographical designates for any kind of disease, because it has the tendency to stigmatize the people who live in that part of the world.
I object to calling it the Kansas flu. I'm a Kansan here online. What is this, Claudia?
Right.
I'm up with Kansas.
Okay. All right. No geography. No geography.
Yes. So even though a lot of the media coverage still uses phrases like the Spanish flu. You know, we should probably refrain from that for obvious reasons.
Is it an H1? What type of flu? What do you call it?
It was H1N1.
H1N1. Okay. And
yeah,
and as far as you know, at that point in history, nobody was looking around and saying the Spanish flu and that there might be a connection to this the outbreak of encephalitis, I think they call it, or sleeping sickness. Right?
It's interesting. I'd like to see the book that you read about that in, because I haven't come across that theory at all. I don't know I don't know of anyone who is trying to make the connection between sleeping sickness and influenza.
I don't know how authoritative it is. The name is Awake.
Okay.
Oh no, I think it's called Awake. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. One of the difficult things talking about the 1918 flu is that in 1918, flu was not a reportable disease. So medical authorities did not have to gather statistics on how many people were getting infected or dying from influenza. It just wasn't regarded as that important of a disease. And in addition to that, when people did die of the flu in a hospital, for example, doctors would often indicate that they had been killed by something else. So we don't know that much about it. We know that it was H1N1 because interestingly, we have preserved blood samples from soldiers who died as a result of the flu, and we've been able to genetically test the RNA in the remnants of the virus in these frozen samples, and on the basis of that, we know that it was H1N1.
Do we have other questions from anyone? I'm not seeing anyone unmute themselves to ask questions. Any further questions from anyone? Okay, well, if that's the end of the questions that people would like to ask, I suggest that we all thank Professor Bowen for his talk today, and you can press the reaction buttons in order to clap if you want. And then I will stop the recording for today, and I will say thank you to everyone for coming to this edition of the semester of this seminar series, and we hope to have some more talks for you later in the semester. Thank you to everyone for coming.